The wind in the high Colorado country was not a sound. It was a weapon. It came down from the peaks with a razor's edge, slicing through the canvas of Silas Monroe's coat and chilling the marrow in his bones. He was in his late 30s, but the mountains and the silence had weathered him past his years, carving deep lines beside his eyes and mouth. He rode the edge of his property, his gaze sweeping the endless white, checking the fences that were buried 3 feet deep in drifts. His horse, a sturdy gray gelding named Jeb, snorted, the vapor freezing instantly in the air. It was the horse that stopped first, tossing its head and sidling, refusing to move toward the sparse line of aspen near the creek bed. "What is it, boy?" Silas's voice was a low rasp, swallowed by the gale. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking deep. He trusted the horse. Jeb had smelled mountain cats and unseen wolves before. Silas pulled his rifle from the scabbard, his eyes scanning the trees. There was nothing, just the white, the gray bark of the aspens, and the relentless shriek of the wind. He took a step, pushing the horse forward. "Hup! Nothing here!" Then he saw it. It was not a man. It was a bundle of rags, dark against the snow, huddled at the base of the very tree where his horse was tethered. No, not tethered. He had tied Jeb here an hour ago while he fixed a wire break. He had ridden off and somehow circled back. He'd forgotten the horse. His memory had been failing him like that. Lately, he approached, rifle low. It was a person. A drift of snow had nearly covered a body, curled tight against the trunk, seeking shelter that was not there. He knelt, his knee cracking the ice crust, and rolled the figure over. It was a woman. She was young, perhaps 10 years his junior. Her face was a terrifying shade of blue-gray, her lips cracked and pale. Ice clung to her eyelashes and matted her dark hair. He put a gloved hand to her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, a thread so thin it felt more like a memory than a life. She was half frozen, but worse. She looked starved. Her form beneath the soaked wool coat was frail, sharp angles of bone beneath the cloth. She was a stranger. No one lived up here. His ranch was the last stop before the territory climbed into impassable peaks. To be here, on foot, in this storm, was a death sentence. He cursed, low and bitter. This was not his trouble. He had enough trouble. He had a lifetime of it. He moved to lift her. She weighed almost nothing. As he gathered her against his chest, her head lolled back, and a faint sound escaped her lips. A breath of frozen air. "Rebecca?" Silas went rigid. The wind stopped. The world stopped. His blood turned to ice, colder than the snow. He looked down at the woman's face. Her eyes were closed, sealed shut with cold. She was delirious. She had to be. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 5 years. Not since he had carved it into a piece of pine, his hands raw and bleeding from digging in the frozen earth. "What did you say?" he demanded of the unconscious woman. She only shivered, a violent, rattling spasm that seemed to shake her very soul. He stared at her, suspicion and a cold, deep dread coiling in his gut. Who was she? How could she know that name? He looked around the empty, hostile landscape. There was no one, just him, the woman, and the ghost she had summoned. He could not leave her. To leave her was murder, and he was many things, but not that, but bringing her in, after what she'd whispered. It felt like a violation. It felt like letting a curse cross his threshold. He threw her over the saddle, mounted behind her, and kicked Jeb into a painful, stumbling run back toward the cabin. The woman was a dead weight, floppy and cold against him. He held her tight, his arm wrapped around her waist, and tried to ignore the name echoing in his head. Rebecca. His cabin was small, built of thick logs he had cut and hauled himself. It was a fortress against the weather and the past. He kicked the door open and carried the woman inside, the sudden warmth of the stove fire hitting them like a wall. He hesitated. His bed was in the corner, covered with a thick buffalo hide. He had not slept in it for years. Not really. He used the narrow cot by the fire, leaving the bed as a sort of shrine, untouched, the way it was when He shook the memory away, angry at the intrusion. He dumped the woman onto the cot, then thought better of it. The cot was too near the fire. She would thaw too fast. Or perhaps he simply did not want her in his space. With a grunt of frustration, he lifted her again and placed her on the big bed. His bed. Rebecca's bed. For 3 days, she did not wake. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency he had not used in half a decade. He cut the frozen clothes from her body with his hunting knife, careful not to slice the skin. Though it was so cold it likely would not have bled. Her body was thin, terribly thin. But what shocked him were the marks. Old bruises, yellow and purple, shadowed her ribs. A long, puckered scar ran along her forearm, white and angry. This was a woman who had been handled rough. He covered her with his heaviest wool blankets and began the slow work of bringing her back. He melted snow, boiled it, and forced lukewarm water between her lips. He made a thin broth from a smoked rabbit and did the same. She had a fever. She burned hot for 2 days, shivering and muttering things he could not understand. He sat in the chair by the bed, rifle across his knees, and just watched her. He was waiting. He was waiting for her to say the name again. She mumbled about Kansas. She cried out, "No, please," and thrashed, kicking off the blankets he patiently replaced. She spoke of a fire, but she did not say Rebecca. He found himself watching her face in the firelight, when she was not contorted in feverish nightmares. Her features were soft. She looked like she had been gentle. Once, before the world had tried to break her, he felt a stir of something unwelcome, a dull pity. It made him angry. He did not want to feel pity. He wanted her to wake up, explain herself, and leave. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. He woke on his cot to the sound of a sharp gasp. He was on his feet in an instant. Hand on the knife at his belt, the woman was awake. She was staring at the log ceiling, her eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. "Where am I?" Her voice was a dry croak. "My cabin." Silas did not move closer. He let her see him, a big man in the shadows, his face stern and unreadable. She tried to sit up, but cried out and fell back, her strength gone. Her eyes darted around the small room, the stone hearth, the cured hides on the wall, the single window showing nothing but a wall of swirling snow. And finally, him. "Who are you?" "Silas Monroe. You were freezing to death on my land." He dipped a ladle into the water bucket and held it out. "Drink." She drank, greedily, spilling water down her chin. He gave her a piece of jerky to chew on, something to give her strength, and she worked on it in silence, her eyes never leaving him. They were dark eyes, bruised with exhaustion. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice stronger. "Clara May Cunningham." He nodded, waiting. I'm a widow, from Kansas." "Kansas is a long way to walk," Silas said flatly, "especially in a blizzard. Where was your wagon, your horse?" Clara looked away, her gaze falling to the blanket bunched in her hands. "I lost them. The wagon. It broke an axle. I tried to ride the horse, but the storm. I got lost. I walked." It was a lie. He knew it was a lie. You do not walk from Kansas to the high peaks of Colorado. You do not cross the plains alone, on foot, in winter. And she had no gear, no pack, nothing. She had been found with only the clothes on her back. "You were heading west, then," he said. It was not a question. "A fresh start," she whispered. "I just needed a fresh start." "You won't find it up here," Silas said, his voice hard. "There's nothing up here but snow and rock and things that want to kill you." She flinched at his tone, but nodded. "I see that now. Thank you, Mr. Monroe, for my life." "Don't thank me yet," he said, turning back to the fire. "The storm settled in. You're not going anywhere, and neither am I." The tension in the cabin became as thick and suffocating as the snow piling up outside the door. They were trapped, for days. The world was reduced to the 4 walls of the cabin and the howl of the wind. They fell into a tense, silent rhythm. He would rise before dawn, stoke the fire, and head out to the barn to feed Jeb and the 2 milk cows. The work was brutal in the storm, the snow drifting chest-high. It took him hours just to clear a path. When he returned, stinging with cold, she would be awake. She was quiet, and she was guarded. But she was not unkind. She was weak, but she refused to stay in the bed. She would sit by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, and watch him. When he cooked, she would ask, "Can I help?" At first, he refused. "Just sit, get your strength." But she was insistent. "I must earn my keep. Mr. Monroe, I cannot be a burden." He tossed her a sack of potatoes and a knife. "Peel." She did. Her hands were clumsy, her fingers still stiff and numb from the cold. But she worked until the whole sack was done. She swept the hearth. She took his torn shirts and, with a small sewing kit he kept in a tin, mended them. Her stitches were small and neat. Silas watched her. He was a quiet man by nature. Grief had made him silent. He sat at his small table, cleaning his rifle or oiling his saddle tack. And he watched her. He watched her move. She was graceful, but with a hesitation, as if expecting a blow for moving too quickly. He watched her eat. She ate slow, as if savoring every bite, but her eyes were always alert. He did not know what to make of her. She was a contradiction, frail but stubborn, terrified but polite, and she was a liar. But more than that, she was the woman who had whispered his wife's name. He had not asked her about it. He told himself it was the fever, a random sound, a name from her own past. Perhaps, but the coincidence was a burr under his skin, irritating him, keeping him on edge. One night, the storm reached its peak. The wind screamed like a banshee, and the cabin groaned under the weight of the snow on its roof. Silas sat on his cot, staring into the flames. Clara was on the floor, on a rug near the hearth, mending one of his gloves. He found himself thinking of another storm, 5 winters ago. It had started just like this, with a wind that sounded hungry. Rebecca had been near her time. The midwife was snowed in down in the valley. He remembered the panic. He remembered the blood on the snow when he ran to the barn, thinking, stupidly, that he could ride for help. He remembered coming back to a silence that was worse than the wind, a terrible, final silence. He had buried them both the next day. The ground was iron. It took him 8 hours to dig the hole, his body screaming with exertion, his mind numb. He buried Rebecca and the tiny, blue infant boy she had held for only a minute, in the pine box he had built for a cradle. He had not spoken to another soul for 3 months after that. He had just stayed. The guilt was a heavy coat he never took off. If he had not been fixing the fence on the south ridge, if he had been here when the pain started, maybe he could have... He rubbed his face, his hand rough. He had lived alone ever since. He preferred it. The silence was clean. Now, this woman, this Clara, had breached it. She had finished the glove and set it down. She was staring into the fire, her body rocking, just slightly, in a rhythm of comfort. And then she started to hum. It was a simple tune, a quiet, sad little melody, one that rose and fell like a gentle breath. Silas stopped breathing. His blood ran cold, then hot. He knew that song. It was not a common tune. It was a strange, minor-key lullaby. Rebecca used to hum it. She said her grandmother had taught it to her. She hummed it when she was kneading bread, when she was planting her small garden. She had hummed it the night before she died, her hand on her swollen belly. He had not heard it in 5 years. He stood up so fast the cot scraped against the floor. Clara jumped, a small, terrified sound catching in her throat. His voice was a raw growl. "Where did you learn that?" She stared at him, her eyes wide. "What? I was just... The song..." He took a step toward her. She scrambled backward, pushing herself against the stone of the hearth. "The song you were humming. Where did you hear it?" I don't know," she stammered, her hands held up as if to ward him off. "Please, I don't know. It's just a tune." "That is not just a tune," Silas said, his voice shaking with a cold rage he did not understand. "That was my wife's song. You came here, freezing to death, and you whispered her name. Now you are singing her song. You will tell me who you are." Clara was pale, trembling. She looked from his face to the door, as if measuring her chances of making it into the blizzard. "I told you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I am Clara Cunningham. I swear, the name, I must have been dreaming. And the song, I learned it a long time ago, at a mission house." "A mission house," he repeated, skeptical. "Yes, in Kansas. Before I was married, there was another woman there. She used to hum it. She was kind to me. I must have remembered it from her." "What woman?" Silas demanded. "What was her name?" Clara shook her head, the tears now rolling down her cheeks. "I don't remember. It was so long ago. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know it was your wife's. Please, Mr. Monroe, it was just a song." He stared at her, his chest aching. He saw the terror in her eyes, and it was genuine. She was telling the truth, or part of it, but she was holding something back. He could feel it. The mission house. The woman. The tension in the cabin was a living thing, a coiled snake between them. He wanted her gone. He wanted her out of his house, out of his life. She was a liar, a ghost, a reminder of everything he had lost. When the storm ended, he would take her to town. He would give her to the sheriff, let her be someone else's problem. He turned his back on her, grabbing a log and throwing it onto the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney. "Go to bed," he ordered, his voice flat and dead. "Get some sleep." He heard her scramble back to the big bed, the ropes creaking as she lay down. He sat on his cot, facing the fire, and did not sleep. He was trapped here, in his own home, with a woman who knew his wife's name and sang his wife's song. He debated sending her away as soon as the wind died, throwing her out into the cold he had saved her from. But as he listened to the blizzard rage outside and the quiet, frightened breaths of the woman in his bed, he knew he would not yet. Something in her eyes held him. It was not just fear. It was a haunted, hollow look he recognized. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. The storm did not break. It settled, becoming less a violent assault and more a permanent state of being. The world beyond the cabin window was a churning, endless white, erasing the mountains, the trees, and the very concept of direction. The snow piled in great, soft drifts against the north wall, and the cold was a physical presence that seeped through the chinking of the logs. For Silas, the work became a battle for survival. The path to the barn, which he had cleared, was gone every morning. A new trench to be dug. The cows grew restless, their lowing a dull complaint in the hay-scented dark. Jeb stomped his feet, needing to run. Clara refused to be idle. After the confrontation over the lullaby, a fragile, unspoken truce had formed. She would not hum, and he would not ask. But she seemed to understand that to be useless in this place was to be a ghost, and she was not ready to be that. "I cannot just sit," she said one morning, her voice quiet but firm. "You are feeding me from your stores. I must work." Silas looked at her. She was stronger. The blue-gray of her skin had been replaced by a pale, translucent white, but her eyes were clear. He nodded once, curtly. "Put on the spare coat, the one by the door, and the boots." The coat was Rebecca's. It was too large for Clara, hanging on her small frame, but it was warm. He did not let himself think on it. He took her to the barn. The air was warmer, thick with the animal smell of hay and manure. "You know horses?" he asked. "Some. My father kept a plow horse. This is Jeb." He gestured to the gelding, who watched Clara with intelligent, wary eyes. "He needs to be brushed. Currycomb is on the wall. Get the ice from his coat, then the deep dirt. Be firm. He respects a firm hand." He watched her for a moment. She approached the horse slowly, speaking in a low, soft voice, her hand held out. Jeb, who was often gruff with Silas, surprised him by nudging her palm. Clara's shoulders, which were always held in a tight, protective hunch, relaxed by a fraction. "Good," Silas grunted, and left her to it. He taught her other things. He taught her how to check the smokehouse, how to bank the low fire of hickory chips so it would smolder but never flame. He showed her the hams and sides of bacon hanging in the fragrant dark, explaining how to spot mold, how to test for readiness. He taught her how to mend wire. He brought a snapped length of fence into the cabin, along with his tools. "You can't just twist it," he said, his big calloused hands working the metal. "You have to make a loop, feed it through, wrap it tight, like this. Otherwise the cattle will lean on it and it'll pop right open come spring." She learned quickly. Her hands, though scarred, were nimble. She was capable, but she was also damaged. He saw it when he tossed her a feed sack. She flinched, her arm coming up to cover her face, an instinctive, lightning-fast gesture. She froze, her eyes wide, realizing what she had done. She lowered her arm slowly, her cheeks burning red. "Sorry," she whispered. Silas did not reply. He just turned, pretending to check a harness, and gave her a moment to collect herself. He saw it again when she was reaching for the curry comb. Her sleeve, the borrowed sleeve of Rebecca's coat, fell back. Her forearm was a map of old pain. He had seen the long, puckered scar when he'd first undressed her, but there were others, small, round marks, pale against her skin, like burns. He looked away, a cold, hard anger tightening his jaw. He knew those marks. He had seen them on a mule bought from a cruel freighter. The silence in the cabin at night was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of her breathing, the rustle of her mending, the soft scrape of her spoon in her bowl. They talked more, though it was hardly conversation. It was an exchange of necessities. "The water bucket is low. I mended your socks. The wind is shifting." But one night, the storm seemed to fall into a lull. The wind did not howl. It just moaned, a low, mournful sound. The fire crackled, casting deep shadows. Silas was cleaning his rifle, the smell of gun oil sharp in the air. Clara was sitting on the hearth rug, her knees drawn to her chest, watching the flames. "I had a child," she said. The words were so quiet. Silas thought he had imagined them. He stopped rubbing the cloth on the barrel. He did not look at her. He waited. "He was a boy. He didn't live." Her voice was flat, a recitation of a fact she had worn smooth with telling herself. Silas said nothing. He knew this ground. It was hollow. "He was born too soon, 3 years ago." She picked at a loose thread on the rug. "My husband. He was a preacher, a man of God." She said the words with a dull, bitter irony. He did not like to be questioned. He did not like me to be slow." She took a shaky breath. "I was with child. I was clumsy. I dropped a plate. He said the Lord despised waste." Silas's hands tightened on the rifle stock. He could feel the grain of the wood bite into his palms. He kept his eyes on the fire. "He took his belt to me. I fell. I lost the baby that night, on the cellar floor." A log in the fireplace split, sending a shower of bright embers up the chimney. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the fire and the distant, grieving wind. Silas slowly, deliberately, set the rifle down. He leaned forward, picked up the poker, and nudged the broken log back into the heart of the flames. He still had not looked at her. He had no words. There were no words for such a thing. "I'm sorry," was a useless, thin phrase. He knew. He had heard it from the women in town. After Rebecca, it meant nothing. So he said nothing. He sat there, his shoulders broad, his presence a solid, unmoving shadow. He did not flinch from her words. He did not look away from the fire. He just listened. He accepted the weight of her story and added it to his own. Clara, who had been tensed for a rejection, for a word of pity, or for him to simply leave, found herself breathing easier. His silence was a strange, rare kind of protection. It was not gentle. It was solid. It was, perhaps, the first time a man had heard her truth and not tried to fix it, or blame her for it. He cleared his throat. "You need to get more wood for the box," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll show you where I keep it dry, in the lean-to, tomorrow." It was. She understood. His way of saying, "I heard you. Now we survive." A glimmer of his guarded tenderness, buried deep under 5 winters of grief, had begun to show. The air in the cabin changed. It was charged with something new, something that hummed beneath their tense silence. It was the awareness of 2 bodies, a man and a woman, living in a space no bigger than a large wagon. Silas found himself struggling. He was a man who had lived on his own, his thoughts his only company. Now, he was aware of her. He was aware of the scent of her, a faint smell of wood smoke and soap. He was aware of the curve of her neck when she bent over her mending, the dark, fine hair that escaped her braid. He tried not to look at her body. He told himself it was wrong. This was Rebecca's home, but Clara's body was a fact. It was thin, yes, but it was soft. He saw the shape of her breasts beneath the loose wool shirt he had given her, the swell of her hip as she moved. He would find his eyes drawn to her and would jerk his gaze back to the fire or his work, his jaw tight with self-loathing. For Clara, it was different. She was terrified of him. Still, he was big and quiet, and he had a temper she had seen once. But he had not hurt her. He had fed her. He had listened to her worst secret and had not flinched. She found herself watching his hands. They were huge, rough, scarred from work and cold. But they were steady. She watched him split wood, a single, powerful, clean motion. She watched him gentle jab, his touch surprisingly careful on the horse's muzzle. She kept her distance. She avoided eye contact, but she lingered. When he was at the table, she would find a task near the hearth, keeping him in her line of sight. It was the watchfulness of a wary animal, but it was more than that. It was a pull, an invisible thread, and it was drawing them both taut. The tension finally snapped in the barn. The storm had briefly cleared, the sun a weak, watery light in the sky. Silas was pitching fresh hay into Jeb's stall. Clara was refilling the water trough, breaking the skim of ice with a hammer. She finished and went to hang the bucket on a peg high on the wall. She was small and had to stretch, standing on her toes. As she reached up, the sleeve of her borrowed coat, the one that was too long, snagged on a sharp nail near the peg. She pulled, but it held fast. "Oh," she said, frustrated. She pulled again, harder, and the fabric ripped. "Wait." Silas's voice came from behind her. He was suddenly there. He was too close. She was trapped between him and the wall of the stall. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the cold air and hay on his clothes. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "Stand still," he commanded, his voice low. He reached up, his arm brushing her shoulder. His body was a wall behind her. She could feel his chest, solid as oak, against her back. She stared at the rough-hewn wood of the wall, breathing in the scent of him, her body rigid. His large, gloved fingers worked at the nail. He was slow, methodical. "It's caught proper," he muttered. He had to work his fingers under the thick wool, his knuckles brushing her arm. She squeezed her eyes shut. She was trembling. He freed the material, his hand lingering for a moment on her sleeve. She could feel the warmth of his touch through the coat, through her shirt, all the way to her skin. She turned her head, just slightly, to look at him. It was a mistake. His face was inches from hers. She could see the gray in his beard, the deep lines by his eyes, the eyes themselves, a startling, clear blue, staring at her mouth. He stopped breathing. She stopped breathing. The only sound in the barn was the soft munching of the horse and the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of her own heart. He leaned in. It was a fractional movement, an unconscious tilt of his head. His eyes were dark, his gaze fixed. She saw his lips part, just slightly. She felt his breath, warm, on her cheek. She should have run. She should have screamed, but she did not. She tilted her chin up. Then, as fast as it happened, it was over. Jeb snorted and banged his hoof against the stall door, demanding more hay. Silas jerked back as if he'd been burned. He stumbled a step, his face a mask of anger and confusion. He looked at her, his eyes cold again, furious. Clara turned and fled. She ran from the barn, her boots slipping in the new snow, and did not stop until she was inside the cabin. The heavy door slammed shut. The bar dropped. She leaned against it, shaking, her hand pressed to her mouth, where she could still feel the phantom touch of his breath. Silas stood in the barn for a long time. He gripped the pitchfork, his knuckles white. He was shaking with a guilt so profound it made him sick. He had almost kissed her, in his wife's coat. He had almost kissed a stranger, a liar, a woman who had come out of the storm like a bad omen. He wanted her gone. He wanted her gone now. That night, the dreams came back. Silas had not dreamed of Rebecca in years. He had memories, but the dreams had stopped. Now, she was there. She was standing in the snow, wearing the white dress she was buried in. Her dark hair was loose, and she was holding the pine cradle. She was not angry. She was just sad. She looked at him, her eyes full of a disappointment that was worse than rage. "You promised, Silas," she whispered, her voice like the wind. "You promised." He woke up on his cot, his heart pounding, his skin clammy. He was covered in a cold sweat. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to embers. He could hear Clara's soft, even breathing from the big bed. His guilt was a physical thing, a stone in his stomach. What was he doing? He had mourned his wife. He had built a wall of ice around his heart. And this woman, this child, had breached it in a matter of days. He felt like he was betraying Rebecca all over again. He was feeling something for a stranger, and it felt like a sin. The next day, he was cruel. He was silent and stern. His words clipped. He found fault with everything she did. The coffee was too weak. She used too much wood on the fire. She was too slow feeding the chickens. Clara bore it in silence, her head bowed, her face pale. She just nodded, whispered, "Yes, Mr. Monroe," and tried to stay out of his way. She knew she had caused it. The moment in the barn, she had crossed a line. She had made him see her as a woman, and now he hated her for it. Afraid to be idle, afraid to be in his presence. She began to explore the cabin, cleaning things that were not dirty. She dusted the shelves, straightened the tins of coffee and flour. On the mantel, high above the fire, sat a small, carved wooden box. She had not touched it. It felt private, but now, driven by a restless, anxious energy, she took it down. Inside, there was a ribbon, a small, dried flower, and a photograph. It was a daguerreotype, in a hinged velvet case, a portrait of a man and a woman. The man was Silas, but younger, his face softer, unlined by grief. He was wearing a stiff suit, his hair slicked back. He was not smiling, but his eyes were bright. The woman beside him was beautiful. She had dark, piled-up hair and a strong, proud face. She was looking at the camera, but her hand was linked with Silas's. She wore a lace-collared dress. It was Rebecca. Clara stared at the face, her blood running cold. She traced the woman's jawline with her finger. She had seen this face before, not just in her fever dreams. She knew this face. "What are you doing?" Silas's voice cut through the silence like an axe. Clara gasped, dropping the box. The photograph clattered to the floor. She knelt, fumbling, to pick it up. I was just dusting," she stammered, her hands shaking as she tried to close the case. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "I told you not to touch my things." He strode across the room and ripped the photograph from her hand. He looked at it, his face tight with pain, and then at her. His eyes were narrowed, suspicious. "You were studying it?" "No, she's beautiful." "Do not," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Do not talk about her." "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, backing away. "You looked at her, like you knew her." His eyes were pinning her, sharp and accusing. "You knew the song. You knew the name. Now you're holding her picture." Clara looked at the floor, her heart pounding. The lie was on her tongue. "I don't know what you mean." But she could not say it. She was so tired of lying, and she was so terrified of him sending her away. I think I met her?" she whispered, the words barely audible. A woman, named Rebecca, at the mission house. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas stared at her, his face ashen. The mission house in Kansas, he said, his voice flat. Clara nodded, her eyes filling with tears. It was only for a little while. She was just passing through, I think. She was kind to me. She hummed that song. I didn't know it was your wife. I didn't know you, I swear. What did you talk about? He demanded. He took a step closer, his hands clenched at his sides. Tell me, what did she say? I don't remember, Clara cried, covering her face. It was years ago. I was sick. Please, I don't remember. Don't be angry. She was panicking, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. She looked like a trapped rabbit, her eyes darting to the door, to the window, looking for an escape that was not there. Silas stopped. He saw her terror, and it was not the guilt of a liar. It was the primal fear of an animal that expects to be struck. He saw the way she cringed, her shoulders up, her hands protecting her head, and he realized, with a sickening lurch, that he was doing the very thing he despised. He was being the man with the belt. He backed off. He took a deep, shuddering breath and ran his hand over his face. Go, he said, his voice raw. Just go sit down. Leave it. He turned his back on her, picked up the photograph, and gently placed it back in its box. He put the box on the mantel, his movements stiff. He could feel her watching him, feel her terror radiating across the small room. He knew he had terrified her, and he was ashamed. But he was also shaken to his core. That night, the tension was unbearable. They did not speak. They did not eat. Silas sat on his cot, staring at the wall. Clara sat on the rug, her arms wrapped around her shins, her body as small and tight as she could make it. The silence stretched, broken only by the pop of the fire. Suddenly, a sound tore from Clara's throat. It was a sob, a dry, ragged sound of a heart breaking. She pressed her face into her knees, her whole body shaking. She was not just crying for his anger or the photograph. She was crying for the baby on the cellar floor, for the husband who was a preacher, for the weeks of running, the cold, the hunger. She was crying for all the pain she had held inside, and it was all coming out. Silas sat frozen. His first instinct was to do nothing, to let her cry. It was not his business. He was not her keeper. But the sound, it was the sound of utter, hopeless despair. It was a sound he knew well. He had made it himself, in the barn, his face pressed against Jeb's warm neck. In the months after Rebecca died, he stood up. He walked the few feet to the hearth and stiffly, awkwardly, sat on the stone beside her. He did not touch her. He just sat, a large, looming presence. She cried harder, her sobs echoing in the small, warm room. Finally, his hand moved. It was a heavy, hesitant movement. He placed it on her back, between her shoulder blades. She flinched, violently, but he did not move his hand. He just kept it there, solid, warm. She cried for a long time. He said nothing. He just sat, his hand on her back, until the storm of her grief began to quiet, her sobs turning into hitched, gasping breaths. She finally lifted her head. Her face was a ruin, blotched and wet. She looked at him, her eyes raw. "I'm so tired," she whispered. He looked at her, his own eyes aching. He saw her pain, and it was no longer separate from his own. It was just pain. He slowly, gently, brushed the damp hair from her face. His rough thumb grazed her cheek. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He leaned in. This time, it was not an accident. It was not guilt. It was a choice. His lips were almost on hers. He could feel her breath, warm and shaky. She was not running. She was waiting. He was about to kiss her. He was about to erase 5 years of solitude, 5 years of loyalty to a ghost. But it was Clara who moved. She put her hand on his chest, and with a gentle, undeniable pressure, she pushed him down. Not away, but down. She pulled him gently, guiding him, until he was lying on the rug beside her, on his side, facing her. She lay down, too, curling into the space he made. She did not kiss him. She just lay there. She pressed her cold face into the rough wool of his shirt, her arm settling over his waist, holding on like a drowning woman. Silas was rigid for a moment, his body hard as stone. This was more intimate than a kiss. This was a surrender. He felt her body, small and trembling, tucked against his. He could feel her heart beating against his ribs. Slowly, his arm came around her. He pulled her closer, his hands spreading wide on her back, holding her. He rested his chin on the top of her head. They lay there, tangled together on the rug, the fire warming their faces. There was no intimacy, no passion. It was something older, something more desperate. It was two broken, lonely souls, finding a flicker of warmth in the middle of a long, dark winter. After a few minutes, her breathing deepened, her body relaxing in his arms. She was asleep. Silas lay awake, staring into the dying embers. He held the woman who knew his wife's name, and for the first time in 5 years, his heart did not feel like it was frozen solid. It just ached. The world began to drip. That was the first sign. For weeks, the only sounds had been the shriek of the wind and the crackle of the fire. Now, a new sound joined them, the steady, relentless plink, plink, plink of water falling from the eaves. The thaw had begun. The snow was pulling back from the south-facing walls of the cabin, revealing a world of mud and brown. Dormant grass, the creek, which had been a frozen scar, began to gurgle. Inside the cabin, the air was just as changed. Since the night they had slept on the hearth rug, an awkward, fragile peace had settled. They still kept their distance, but the sharp, brittle tension was gone. They were two people who had seen the other's deepest vulnerability. They spoke in low tones, a hesitant politeness that was almost tenderness. With the thaw, the path to town was no longer a suicide run. It was a muddy, treacherous, but possible. And they were low on flour, and coffee, and salt. "I'm riding to town," Silas announced one morning, pulling on his heavy coat. Henson's Creek. Clara, who was washing their breakfast plates in a bucket of hot water, froze. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a familiar, hunted look. Being left alone was, he realized, a terror for her. "Bar the door behind me," he said, his voice neutral. He did not want to be kind. He was not ready for that, but he could not be cruel. "Don't open it. For anyone. I'll be back before dark." "Please," she whispered. "Be careful." He just nodded, settled his hat on his head, and left. The ride was brutal. The snow was still 3 feet deep in the drifts, but it was wet and heavy. A slush that sucked at Jeb's hooves. The world was gray and dripping. It felt like the land itself was weeping. He rode for 3 hours, following the creek bed, his mind blessedly empty, focused only on the horse's footing and the path. Henson's Creek was not much of a town. It was a single muddy street with a mercantile, a saloon, a livery, and a land office. As he tied Jeb to the hitching post outside Patterson's mercantile, he felt the strangeness of rejoining the world, the sound of other men's voices, the smell of wet wool and cheap whiskey from the saloon. It was all jarring. He entered the mercantile. The place was warm, smelling of cinnamon, bolt cloth, and cured tobacco. Old man Patterson nodded at him from behind the counter. "Monroe, thought the mountain had swallowed you." "Just about," Silas grunted. "Need flour, 2 sacks, and coffee, salt, a block of it." As Patterson weighed out the coffee beans, Silas drifted toward the pot-bellied stove. 3 men were gathered around it, muddy boots smoking as they dried. "Came right through here." One of them, a teamster Silas recognized, was saying, Marshall, hard-looking man, rode south, said he was tracking a fugitive." "Man or woman?" another asked. "Woman," the teamster said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the sawdust box. Said she's a widow, from Kansas. Young thing, dark hair, small. Silas went cold. His hand, which had been reaching for the warmth of the stove, stopped. He did not turn. He just listened. What she wanted for? The worst kind. Arson and murder. The teamster leaned in. Burned her own house down with her husband inside. He was a preacher, they say. Just roasted him alive in his own study and took off with what little money he had. Name of Cunningham. Clara May Cunningham. The mercantile fell silent. Silas could hear the scrape of the coffee scoop, the tick of the clock on the wall. The description was not close. It was perfect. He felt a fool, a blind, stupid fool. He had taken in a snake. He had held her while she cried. He had let her sleep in his bed. This black widow killer who burned men alive. His guilt over Rebecca. The dreams. The near kiss in the barn. It all came rushing back, twisted with a new, cold, violent anger. He had been played. "That'll be $4.20. Monroe," Patterson called out. Silas turned. His face was a mask of stone. He walked to the counter, pulled the small leather poke from his pocket, and counted out the coins. He did not speak. He did not ask questions. He loaded his supplies into his saddlebags, his movements stiff. He mounted Jeb and rode out of town, not looking back. The ride home was a descent into a private hell. Every kindness she had shown him, every flicker of vulnerability, now seemed a calculated lie. The bruises, the scars. Had she gotten them from the fire, from her escape? The lullaby, the name Rebecca. Had she heard it in town? Had this all been a long, sick game to find a place to hide? He hated her. But beneath the hate was a deeper, more chilling feeling. He had been drawn to her. He had almost... He spurred Jeb into a punishing trot. When he reached the ridge overlooking his cabin, he saw her. She was a small figure, pressed against the glass of the window, watching for him. The sight of her, waiting, sent a fresh jolt of rage through him. She unbarred the door before he even had his foot out of the stirrup. She was smiling, her face alight with a relief so profound it was almost joy. "You're back," she breathed. "I was so worried. The sun, it's going down." Her smile died when she saw his face. He brushed past her, dumping the heavy sacks on the table. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He just moved, his body tight with a fury he was barely holding in. "Silas?" she ventured, her voice small. Is something wrong? Was there trouble in town?" "No trouble," he bit out, his back to her as he unrolled his bedroll. I kept the fire going. There's stew." He nodded. "Once." He sat at the table and ate, his eyes on his plate. He was watching her. He kept his anger locked down. But he watched her. Every move she made, every glance, every breath. Her gentleness now looked like manipulation. Her quietness seemed like cunning. The fragile warmth they had built was not just gone. It was as if it had never existed. The cabin was cold again, colder than the ice storm, filled with his silent, simmering judgment. Clara felt the change like a physical blow. He was not just the grieving, silent man he had been before. This was different. This was a dark, watchful anger. And it was directed at her. She retreated, her own fear returning in a cold wave. She washed the dishes, her hands shaking. She did not speak. She just tried to make herself small, to stay out of the way of the storm she sensed was building in him. This new, terrible silence lasted for 2 days. He would go out, work on the fences, his movements sharp, almost violent. He chopped wood for hours, the thwack of the axe echoing across the valley. He spoke to her only in monosyllables. Clara grew more and more agitated. She was trapped again. She was back in the cellar, waiting for the blow to fall. She knew, with a dreadful certainty, that he had heard something in town. He knew, on the 3rd night, she could not bear it. The moon was high and bright, flooding the cabin with a cold, silver light. Silas was on his cot, his breathing heavy. She thought he was asleep. She could not stay. He hated her. Whatever fragile hope she had found here was dead. He would turn her in. Or worse. moving with the silence of a mouse. She got up from the bed. She was already dressed. She had saved a small heel of bread and a strip of jerky, and she bundled them in her kerchief. She crept to the door. Her hand was on the heavy wooden bar, her fingers trembling as she began to lift it. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was cold iron from the shadows. She froze, her entire body rigid. She turned, her hand still on the bar. He was sitting up on the cot, a large, menacing silhouette against the dim light of the embers. I can't stay," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm a burden. The storm is over. I should go." "You're running," he said. He stood up, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. He was a wall of shadow between her and the room, just like you ran from Kansas. Her blood ran cold. "I don't know what you mean." "Stop lying." He crossed the room in 2 strides, his anger, held back for days, finally breaking free. He was inches from her, his voice a low, raw growl. "I was in town. I heard they're looking for you. A widow from Kansas, Clara May Cunningham, accused of arson, accused of murder." She flinched, a small, choked sound escaping her. "No. Did you kill him?" he demanded, grabbing her shoulder. His grip was iron. "Did you, Clara, did you burn him in his bed? Did you run here and find the first fool you could whisper my wife's name and tell your sad stories?" The accusation, the raw violence in his voice, broke her. She did not cry. She simply collapsed. Her legs gave out, and she slid down the rough wood of the door to the floor, her hands covering her face. "I didn't kill him," she choked out from behind her hands. I didn't set the fire." "Then what?" he said, standing over her, a dark judge. "What happened? Tell me the truth. For once, the truth." She lifted her head, her face pale and ravaged in the moonlight. Her eyes were hollow. The truth. It was all she had left. "My husband," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Elias, he was a preacher." "He spoke of God's love, but he had none." She told him everything. She told him about the miscarriage, the child she had lost on the cellar floor. She told him how Elias had blamed her, called her a sinner, an unfit vessel for a child of God. He didn't just hit me," she said, her voice dropping to a dead, flat tone. "He locked me in the cellar to prey on my sin. He kept me there. It was so cold. I was still bleeding. I was in the dark. For days." Silas's hand, still on her shoulder, went slack. He stared at her, the anger in his face being replaced by a dawning horror. "The storm," she continued, her gaze fixed on the sliver of moonlight on the floor. "I heard it. Thunder, and then a crash. A tree. I think, or lightning. It struck the house." She smelled smoke. It seeped under the cellar door. He was upstairs, in his study. I could hear him. He was drunk. He always was. After his sermons, the house was on fire. "I was going to die there, burn in the dark. I screamed," she said, her voice gaining a frantic edge. "But the heat, it warped the wood of the door, the frame. I kicked it until my feet were bloody. The boards broke. I crawled out." She had crawled into a hallway of smoke and flame. She could hear him. Upstairs, he was shouting, not for help. He was shouting her name, cursing her, calling her a demon. "I ran," she said. She looked up at Silas, her eyes empty of tears, filled only with a terrible, burned-out truth. "I ran out of the house. I stood in the yard, in the rain and the lightning, and I watched it burn. I heard him screaming, and I watched. I didn't move. I didn't help. I just watched him die." She took a ragged, shuddering breath. "I didn't set the fire. Silas, I swear to you, on my life. I didn't, but I'm not sad he's dead. I don't regret it." Her eyes met his. I am glad he is gone. Does that make me a murderer?" Silas was stunned. He backed away from her, his own legs unsteady. He sat down, hard. On the wooden bench by the table, the raw, awful truth of her story settled over him, suffocating him. He looked at her, this small, broken thing on his floor, and he saw her scars, her flinching, her terror. It was not a lie. It was all, horrifyingly, true. His anger was gone, burned away by her story, replaced by a deep, shaking awe. He found himself speaking, his own voice sounding distant. Strange. "My wife," he said. He stared at his own hands, splayed on the table. They looked huge, clumsy, and stained. "Rebecca." Clara watched him, her breath catching. "She didn't just die," he said, the words rusty, as if pulling them up from a deep, dry well. It wasn't peaceful. It was like your fire." He told her. He told her about the storm, just like hers. The midwife who could not come. The labor. 2 days of it. The screaming. Her terrible, animal screaming. "There was so much blood," he whispered. The words tasted like ash. "The baby. He was turned, stuck. I tried. I reached in. I tried to help her. To turn him. I didn't know what I was doing. I think I hurt her. Clara, I think I killed her." He looked up, his eyes a raw, haunted blue, meeting hers across the moonlit room. "She died holding him. He was so small. He was blue. He never even cried. I didn't just lose them." The confession tore from his throat. "I was in the room, my hands. If I had just left her alone, maybe, if I had been smarter or stronger, I was the one. I failed them." The terrible, unspoken truth of his life, his guilt, finally hung in the air between them. Clara understood. In that moment, she understood everything. His silence, his grief that was not just grief, but a prison, his haunted, angry eyes. She slowly, painfully, got to her feet. She crossed the small space between them. She did not sit. She knelt on the floor, between his knees. She took his huge, rough hands in her small, scarred ones. His hands were ice cold. "You didn't kill them, Silas," she said, her voice suddenly, fiercely strong. "You were trying to help. You loved her. You didn't run." "I failed her," he choked out, his whole body shaking. "You stayed," she whispered. They just looked at each other. Two survivors, their worst secrets laid bare in the dark, with a ragged groan. He pulled her up. He didn't just lift her. He pulled her onto his lap, his arms crushing her to his chest. It was not a gentle embrace. It was desperate. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled of wood smoke, and he held her as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling apart. She held him back, her arms wrapping tight around his thick neck, her face pressed against the rough wool of his shirt. They clung to each other, two people drowning, holding the other up. He pulled his head back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs brushing the tears from her cheeks. He looked at her, his eyes raw. He lowered his head, his lips moving to the soft, warm skin of her neck, just below her ear. He breathed her in, a long, shuddering breath. He wanted to forget. He wanted to be saved. He stopped. His body went rigid. Shame, cold and sharp, cut through him. This was not Rebecca. He was holding another woman. He started to pull away, his face twisting in guilt and self-loathing. But Clara's hand came up. She touched his cheek. Her palm was soft, her touch gentle, but her fingers were firm. She made him look at her. "Silas," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room. "You're allowed to live again." Her words shattered the last wall. He looked at her. He saw her. Not the ghost of his wife. Not the murderer from Kansas, but Clara. Just Clara. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of raw hunger, of 5 years of solitude, of grief, and of a desperate, shared pain. It was clumsy and rough, and tasted of salt from both their tears. She kissed him back with the same wild, starved energy, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. He stood, lifting her with him, her legs wrapping around his waist, He carried her the few feet to the big bed. His bed, Rebecca's bed. He laid her down on the buffalo hide. The moonlight streamed through the window, bathing them in silver and shadow. He stood over her, hesitating, his body trembling. She reached up, her hand outstretched. "Stay," she whispered. Slowly, he unfastened the buttons of his shirt. She watched him. She sat up and, with shaking fingers, she undid the ties of her own shift. They undressed each other, their movements slow, cautious, freighted with the weight of years. Their scars were visible in the moonlight. Hers, the puckered white lines and the small, round burns. His, the long, jagged mark on his ribs from a long-ago fight with a bull. They were two broken, damaged bodies. When they finally touched, skin to skin, it was a shock, a jolt of warmth that was almost painful. They were both trembling. He moved over her, his weight a comfort, not a threat. He braced himself on his arms, looking down at her. He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her jaw. Relearning a language he thought he had buried, he was trying to be gentle. It was slow, cautious. It was a question, not a demand. Every touch was heavy with meaning. When he finally, carefully, entered her, she cried out, a soft, broken sound, and tears streamed from the corners of her eyes, not from pain, from release, from a touch that was tender, not violent. He stopped, instantly. "Did I hurt you?" "No," she whispered, her hands on his back, pulling him closer. "No, don't stop." He moved, slowly at first, then with more confidence, losing himself in the feel of her, the warmth of her. And in the peak of it, lost in the storm, a name escaped his lips. It was a breath, a sigh, a prayer. "Rebecca." Clara's eyes were open, watching his face. She heard it. She did not flinch. She did not stiffen. Her arms did not loosen. She just accepted it. She accepted all of him. His grief, his past, his ghosts. She pulled his face down and kissed him. Hard. It was that kiss that brought him back. He shuddered, his eyes flying open. Seeing her, Clara, he finished with a ragged groan that was more pain than pleasure, collapsing beside her. Not on her. He immediately pulled her against him, her back to his chest, his arm wrapping around her waist, holding her tight. They lay in silence, their breathing harsh in the quiet cabin. The fire had burned down to red embers. The wind sighed outside, like a living thing. After a long time, he felt her body go slack. Her breathing deepened, evening out. She was asleep. Truly, deeply asleep. Her body limp and heavy in his arms, her defenses finally down. Silas lay awake. He stared into the darkness, holding this strange, damaged woman who had run from a fire. He had crossed a line. He had broken a vow he had made to a ghost. He felt hollowed out, guilty, but he was not cold. For the first time in 5 years, the ice in his chest had cracked. He held her, his past and his present at war inside him, and he did not know who was winning. The cabin became a different place. The silence, once a heavy shroud of grief and suspicion, thinned. It was still quiet. Neither Silas nor Clara were given to easy chatter, but the quiet was now filled with a shared, breathable air. They had confessed their ghosts to each other in the moonlight, and though the ghosts had not vanished, they no longer had to be faced alone. They fell into a rhythm that was more than just survival. It was partnership. Silas would ride the fence lines, and Clara would be there when he returned. A hot meal on the stove. He taught her how to properly bank the fire, and she, in turn, showed him how to mix a sourdough starter that made bread that was light and tangy, not the dense, hardtack bricks he was used to. He found himself watching her. He watched her hands, no longer clumsy with cold, as she kneaded the dough. He watched her face as she sat in the open doorway, her eyes closed, feeling the first true warmth of the spring sun. She was still thin, but the hunted, hollow look was fading from her eyes. Color had returned to her cheeks. One evening, while mending a shirt for him, she began to hum. It was the lullaby, the tune that had once sent him into a cold rage. He tensed, his hand stopping on the harness he was oiling. She looked up, her humming cut short, her face instantly pale. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I forgot." Silas looked at her. He saw the woman who had knelt at his feet, who had told him he was allowed to live. He gave a single, stiff nod. "It's just a tune," he said, his voice low. A small, watery smile touched her lips. After a moment, so low he could barely hear it, she began to hum again. This time, he did not stop her. He just listened, and the song was no longer a violation. It was just a sad, familiar melody in the quiet of the cabin. He even heard her laugh. It was a rare, rusty sound, startled out of her when Jeb, the gelding, snatched Silas's hat from his head and tossed it in the mud. The laugh was sudden and bright, and it struck Silas in the chest with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. He found his own lips twitching in a smile he had not felt in 5 years. But the world was still out there, waiting. The thaw that brought life back to the valley also brought danger. They were in the yard one afternoon, stacking new split wood, when a sound split the air, the high, piercing shriek of a red-tailed hawk. Silas didn't even look up, but Clara dropped the log she was holding. She froze, her body rigid, her face ashen, her eyes locked on the pass to the south. She was not seeing a hawk, she was seeing a marshal, or a man with a rope. "Clara," Silas said, his voice sharp. She didn't hear him. She was trembling, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Clara!" He crossed to her, put his hand on her arm. She flinched, violently, a small cry escaping her before she recognized his touch. She looked at him, her eyes wide with terror. "It's just a bird," she stammered, trying to smile. But her face was a mask of fear. "It was just a hawk," he said, his voice steady, his grip on her arm firm, grounding her. She leaned into him for a moment, her forehead resting against his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I thought—" "I know," he said. He knew. The peace they had built was a fragile thing. It was a small cabin with a very thin door, and the men who were hunting her were not going to be stopped by a thaw. A few days later, he rode to Henson's Creek. He needed grain for Jeb and more cartridges for his rifle. He left Clara with the same instruction. "Bar the door. Open it for no one." Her nod was tight, her eyes already shadowed with the fear of his leaving. In town, he was all business. He bought his supplies from Patterson, nodding to the few men in the store. As he was leaving, he paused, his voice casual. "Heard any more about that marshal, Patterson, the one tracking the woman?" Patterson shook his head, bagging some beans. "Not a word, but it ain't just the law looking for her now. Monroe." "What do you mean?" Patterson gestured with his chin toward the livery. "Take a look. Went up yesterday." Silas's gut tightened. He walked out of the mercantile, his boots sucking at the mud. He crossed the street, nailed to the livery wall. Beside a notice for a stolen horse was a new piece of paper. It was a bounty notice. The ink was stark and black against the white paper. "Wanted," it read in thick letters. "For the crimes of arson and murder. Clara May Cunningham, late of Kansas, 24 years of age, dark hair, brown eyes, small build, $500. Dead or alive? $500. It was a fortune. It was enough to make a man kill his neighbor. It was enough to make men ride into the high country, checking every cabin, every wisp of smoke. Silas stood there for a full minute, the words burning themselves into his mind. Dead or alive? He felt a cold, possessive rage build in him. He had pulled her back from death. She was his. He ripped the notice from the wall, crumpling it in his fist. He strode back to Jeb, mounted, and rode out of town, the paper a hard knot in his hand. He knew he could not keep her hidden. The thaw had opened the mountains. $500 would bring every hungry, trigger-happy man in the territory sniffing at his door. He was right. 3 days later, a man rode up. Silas saw him coming from a long way off. He was not a marshal. He wore no badge. He was a lean, hard-looking man with a rifle in his scabbard and cold, watchful eyes. He rode a good horse, which meant he was successful at his trade. Clara was inside, baking. Silas walked out onto the porch, his own rifle in his hand, held low, casual, but ready. The man reined in about 30 yards from the cabin, his hand near his pistol. "Howdy," the stranger called out, his voice amiable, too amiable. "Howdy," Silas called back. "Just checking my trap lines," the man said, gesturing vaguely toward the high peaks. "Good thaw. Seen anyone pass through this way? Maybe a woman? Traveling alone?" Silas's heart was a cold stone in his chest. "Haven't seen a soul since the snows hit last autumn," he lied, his voice flat. "Just me in the mountains." The stranger's gaze drifted from Silas to the cabin. He noted the curtains in the window. A new addition. He noted the smell of fresh bread on the air. His eyes lingered on the ground, where 2 sets of boot prints, one large, one small, were clear in the damp earth by the wood pile. "Just you," the man repeated, a slow, knowing smile touching his lips. "It's a lonely life. A man could use company." "I like it lonely," Silas said. "Keeps the trouble out." The stranger nodded, the smile never leaving his eyes. "Well, if you do see anyone, there's a reward." He touched the brim of his hat. "Obliged." He turned his horse and rode off. Not fast, just ambling back down the trail. Silas watched him until he was out of sight. He did not go back down the main trail. He cut east, toward the high pass. He was circling. He was a wolf, and he had the scent. Silas went back inside, his face grim. He bolted the door. Clara turned from the stove, her hands white with flour. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. She had seen him through the window. "Trouble," Silas said. He walked to the table and smoothed out the crumpled bounty notice. "He was asking for a woman. He knows. Clara, he saw your tracks." She looked at the paper. She read the words. $500. Her voice was a dead whisper. She looked at him, her eyes filling with a dreadful, final clarity. "I have to go. Now, before he comes back. I won't bring this on you. You saved me. I will not be the end of you." She was already wiping the flour from her hands, her movements jerky, panicked. She grabbed the coat, the one that had been Rebecca's. Silas moved, blocking the door. "No! Silas, you don't understand," she cried, trying to push past him. "Men like that, they will kill you to get to me. They will burn this place to the ground. For $500, they will do anything." "I said, you're not leaving." He put his hands on her shoulders, his grip hard. He was not angry. He was something else. He was resolved. "Not again." She looked at him, her tear-filled eyes searching his. "Then what? We wait. We wait for him to come back with his friends." "No," Silas said. "We ride, not to Henson's Creek. We ride east, over the pass, to the next county. I know a man there. Judge Harlan? I knew him. A long time ago. He's a hard man, but he's fair. We tell him the truth. All of it. It's the only chance we have." Clara stared at him. To ride to a judge, it was suicide. But to stay was death. To run, she could not run any longer. She looked at Silas, at his steady, determined face. He was not letting her go. She nodded. Once, a single, terrified agreement. They left within the hour. They packed light, jerky, hardtack, 2 bedrolls, and ammunition. Silas loaded his rifle and slid it into the scabbard. He handed Clara a small pistol he kept in a drawer. She looked at it, her hands shaking, but she took it. They rode east, pushing the horses hard, climbing into the high, raw country. They did not speak. The only sounds were the wind in the pines and the clatter of hooves on rock. They camped that night in a high meadow, sheltered by a ring of spruce. The air was thin and cold, the stars so close they looked like pinholes in a black blanket. They built a small, smokeless fire, just big enough to boil coffee. They sat, drinking the bitter brew, the silence stretching. It was not the companionable silence of the cabin. It was the tense, shared fear of the hunted. Clara finally broke it. She looked at Silas, his face lit by the low flames, the lines etched deep by worry. "Silas," she said, her voice soft. "Tell me about her. Please, tell me. Tell me about Rebecca." He stiffened. He had told her the death. He had not told her the life. He looked into the fire, his mind going back. He poked at a log, sending a small shower of sparks into the dark. He spoke, his voice low, tasting the words. She was not like you. She was not quiet. She was loud. She laughed all the time. She loved this land. She picked flowers. She tried to make it pretty. He fell silent. Clara waited. "She wanted a child," he said, the words a raw ache. "More than anything, more than she wanted me. I think she felt she was failing, as a woman, as a wife." He looked at Clara, his eyes dark with a pain that was ancient. We lost two, before, early on, each one. It took a piece of her." She grew quiet. She stopped, laughing. He told her everything then. Not just the final, bloody night. He told her of the hope, the years of desperate, aching hope, and the slow, grinding despair. The doctors who had no answers, the folk remedies that did nothing, the bitter, silent meals. When she was with child, the last time, he whispered. She was so scared. She wouldn't let herself be happy. She just waited for it to go wrong. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "And it did. It all went wrong. I told you I failed her. She screamed for so long. Clara, the blood, on the snow. When I ran out. I thought I could make it to town. He couldn't go on. He hunched over, his shoulders shaking, his face in his hands. Clara moved. She didn't hesitate. She went to him, kneeling in the dirt beside him. She put her arms around him, pulling his head to her shoulder. She was small, but she held him, her grip fierce. She held him while he shook with the silent sobs of a man who had not cried in 5 years. She kissed his scarred hand. She kissed his temple. "You loved her," she whispered. "You loved her. That is not failure." He pulled back, his face ravaged. How can I, with you, I feel..." "I know," she said, her hands cupping his rough cheeks. "I know." She looked him in the eyes, her own gaze clear and steady. "I don't want to take her place. Silas, I could never. No one could." He stared at her, his breath catching. I want to stand beside you," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "If you'll let me. You're not the only one with scars. We are both still here." He reached up, his large, rough hand covering hers. He held it, pressing her palm to his face. He said nothing. He didn't need to. In the vast, cold silence of the mountains, they were two people, and they were together. They reached Judge Harlan's cabin the next afternoon. It was not a cabin, really, but a solid, 2-story house built of cut timber, with a sign that read, J.T. Harlan, Circuit Judge. Harlan was an old man, gaunt and tall, with a fringe of white hair and eyes as sharp and gray as flint. He remembered Silas. "Monroe," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "You look like hell. What trouble are you bringing to my door?" They sat in his study, a room lined with books. Silas spoke first, laying out the facts. Then, the judge turned his penetrating gaze on Clara. "Now you, girl, tell me, and do not lie to me. I can smell a lie." Clara told him. She told him everything. About Elias, the belt, the cellar, the fire, the screaming, her escape, and her gladness that her husband was dead. She did not flinch, and she did not pretty it up. When she was finished, the room was silent. Judge Harlan steepled his fingers, staring at her. "A bounty is out," he said. "That is federal paper. A U.S. Marshal has signed it." "It's a lie," Silas said. "Perhaps, but it is a lawful lie. Monroe and you," he said, pointing a long finger at Clara. "You ran. An innocent person does not run. An innocent person who is terrified and alone does," Clara said, her voice shaking, but she held his gaze.
I was glad he was dead. I knew no one would believe me.
The judge looked at her, then at Silas. He sighed, a long, weary sound. I know you, Silas Monroe. You were always a stubborn fool, but you were never a liar, and you were never stupid. He leaned back. I will do this. I will send a wire to the marshal in Kansas. I will make inquiries. I will investigate. But this will take time. Weeks, maybe months. I can promise you nothing. The law is a slow, grinding thing. What do we do? Silas asked. You go home, Harlan said, his face grim. You stay quiet. You farm your land. You do not go to town. You see no one. And Silas, the judge's eyes were hard. Keep that rifle loaded. A bounty notice. It makes men lawless. My wire. It might not be faster than their greed. The ride back was different. A small, cold seed of hope had been planted. But the shadow of the bounty hunters was darker than ever. They were a day from the ranch, riding along the creek bed that marked the edge of Silas's property. They were almost home. Clara suddenly reined in her horse. Silas, stop! What is it? You hear something? No, look, she pointed. That tree, the big cottonwood, the one with the split trunk. Silas looked. It was just a landmark. What about it? I know that tree, she whispered. She swung down from the saddle, her movements trance-like. She walked toward it, her boots sinking in the damp earth. She was drawn to it, as if by a string. I remember this. Clara, what are you talking about? He dismounted, following her. She reached the base of the massive tree. The thaw had washed away the earth around its roots, leaving a small, hollow space. She knelt, her eyes wide, and began to dig with her bare hands, pulling at the mud and wet leaves. Here, she gasped, her fingers hitting something hard. It's here. She pulled a small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle from the earth. It was caked in mud, but the wrapping was intact. Her hands were shaking so badly she could not work the knot. Let me, Silas said, confused. He pulled his knife and cut the string. Clara unfolded the cloth. Inside, nestled in a scrap of dry wool, was a small, tin locket on a leather cord. It was tarnished and dented, but she knew it. I gave this to her, Clara whispered, her voice choked with an awe that was almost terror. I gave this to Rebecca. Silas stared, his mind unable to catch up. What are you saying? At the mission, Clara said, the words tumbling out, the final lie falling away. It wasn't brief. Silas, I lied. I was so scared. I knew her. I knew her well. She looked up at him, her face alive, tears streaming down her cheeks. My husband, Elias, he was a patron of the mission. He would come. He hurt me there, too, before we were married. And Rebecca, she was there, just for a week, passing through. She saw it. She saw what he did. She was the only one. Clara was sobbing now, but her face was shining. She saved me. Silas. She got between us. She faced him down. She was so strong. She told him to leave me be. And he was afraid of her. He backed down. She told me, Clara continued, clutching the locket. She said, a man like that, he will break you or he will kill you. You have to run. She told me to run west. She said she knew a place, a safe place, high in the mountains. Clara's eyes locked on his. She drew me a map. Silas, a map to this ranch, to this tree. She told me, if you ever make it there, if you are ever in real, desperate trouble, you go there. His name is Silas. He's a good man. He'll keep you safe. She told me to bury this locket here, so she would know. So she would know I made it. Silas stood frozen, the world tilting. The name, the lullaby, the woman in his bed. It was not chance. It was not a fever dream. I wasn't just delirious, Clara whispered, rising to her feet, holding the locket out to him. I was looking for you. She sent me to you. Silas stood by the cottonwood tree. the world tilting. The muddy, tarnished locket lay heavy in his palm. It was a cheap, tin thing, but it felt heavier than gold. It felt like a key. He looked at Clara, her face streaked with mud and tears, her eyes shining with a truth so fantastic it had to be real. She had not been running from something. She had been running to something. To him. He felt the ground shift beneath his boots. For weeks, his mind had wrestled with two facts. First, this woman had lied. She had hidden the depth of her connection to his wife. Second, this woman was good, and he was, against all his defenses, coming to care for her. He had seen these two facts as a betrayal, a sin. His guilt had been a wall between them, and her lie had been the mortar in the bricks. Now, he saw. The lie was not a lie. It was a secret, kept out of fear. She had not come to replace Rebecca. She had been sent. His hand, the one that had held his wife as she died, closed around the locket. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, he did not see a stranger who had stumbled into his life. He saw a messenger. He saw a survivor. He saw a woman who had been chosen. She sent you, he whispered, the words sounding hollow and strange in the open air. She told me to follow the creek, Clara said, her voice trembling. She said there was a man here who was as hard as the mountains, but as good as the earth. She was trying to save me. Silas, I was so scared when I first saw you. I thought you would hate me for being alive when she was not, for knowing her. I did, he admitted, his voice raw. I did hate you. I think I hated you because you were alive, and I was not. He felt a sudden, sharp betrayal. But it was not aimed at Clara. It was aimed at himself. He had been so blind, so wrapped in his own perfect, polished grief. He had not seen the truth. His wife, his strong, practical Rebecca, had known her own husband. She had known he was dying on this mountain, hollowed out and alone. And in an act of final, desperate love, she had sent this broken, fleeing woman to him. She had sent him a purpose. He did not feel betrayed by Clara. He felt moved. He felt as if a hand, cold for 5 years, had reached out and touched his shoulder. She never said, he murmured, looking at the locket. She told me she was going to Kansas, to see family. She never mentioned a mission. She never mentioned you. I was a secret, Clara said softly. I was her good deed. I think she was afraid, too, afraid of my husband. She told me to never speak of it, to just run west. Silas looked at the locket, then back at Clara. He took her hand, the one that was not muddy, and pressed the locket back into her palm. He closed her fingers around it. You're home, Clara, he said. They rode back to the cabin. The air between them was no longer heavy with suspicion, but with a strange, shared awe. They had been bound by ghosts, and now, those same ghosts had set them free. The next morning, Clara woke alone in the big bed. The cabin was warm, the fire stoked, but Silas was gone. She felt a moment of cold panic, the old fear of abandonment. She dressed quickly and ran to the door. He was not far. She saw him. He was standing on the small hill behind the cabin, a place he never went. It was a bare patch of earth, marked by a single, weathered pine cross. Silas stood before the grave. The wood was gray, the letters he had carved into it blurred by 5 years of snow and sun. Rebecca Monroe, beloved wife. He had not spoken here, not truly. Since the day he filled the hole, he had come, on anniversaries, in the depths of winter, and stood in silence. But he had not spoken. Becca, he said. His voice was a rusty croak. I don't know if you can hear me, or if this is all just foolishness. He stared at the hard-packed earth. I got so lost after I stopped. Everything just stopped. I let the weeds grow. I let myself grow cold. He took a deep, shuddering breath. She's here. The woman. Clara. The one you sent. He said it, the fact, aloud to the wind. She's brave. Becca, she's broken. Like me, like I was. He reached out and touched the rough wood of the cross. I thought holding on to you, holding on to the pain, that was how I kept you. That if I ever let go, that it meant I didn't love you. He looked back, down the hill. He could see the cabin. He saw the wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. He saw Clara, a small figure, standing in the doorway, watching him. I was wrong, he whispered, his throat tight. I think you were saving me. You didn't want me to be alone. You knew. You always knew. He felt a tear, hot and sharp, cut a path through the dust on his cheek. He did not wipe it away. I love you, Becca. I will always. But I'm so tired. I'm so tired of being alone. I think I may be ready to love again. He stood there for a long time, as the sun climbed higher, warming his back. When he finally turned and walked down the hill, he felt lighter. The grief was still there. It would always be there. It was a part of him, like a scar. But it was not a chain. Not anymore. Clara was at the door. She did not ask what he had done. She just looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw not a question, but an answer. She handed him a cup of hot coffee. The peace that followed was deep, but fragile. They were waiting. Judge Harlan's promise was a thin thread of hope in a dark wood. The man Silas had lied to, the bounty hunter, had not returned. But his presence lingered. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a hawk, made Clara jump. Silas kept his rifle clean and loaded, resting by the door. They lived this way for 2 weeks. They talked. They mended fences. They planted the small, hopeful beginnings of a garden in the patch of earth Rebecca had once tended. They lived as man and wife, sleeping in the big bed, finding comfort in the simple, solid presence of each other in the dark. Then, the riders came. It was late afternoon. The sun was high, the air warm. Clara was scattering feed for the half-dozen chickens she had insisted on buying. Silas was in the barn, re-shoeing Jeb, the sound of his hammer on the anvil a sharp, steady rhythm. Clara heard it first. Horses, more than one, and they were coming fast. She looked up, her hand flying to her throat, spilling the grain. 2 men. They had just cleared the aspen grove and were riding hard up the trail to the cabin. They were not lawmen. One was the man Silas had lied to, the one with the cold, knowing eyes. His name, she would learn, was Clegg. The other was a bigger man, his face scarred, a heavy pistol Holt tied low on his thigh. This was Pike. "Silas!" Clara screamed. It was a high, thin sound of pure terror. In the barn, Silas dropped the hammer. He was at the door in 2 strides. He saw the riders. He saw Clara, frozen in the yard. "Clara, inside! Get the rifle!" he bellowed. "Clegg!" The lead rider laughed. He reined in his horse, raising a cloud of dust. "That's her. That's the one. $500. Pike, right there!" Pike did not stop. He was not a talker. He spurred his horse, cutting off Clara's path to the cabin. He was going to grab her, to rope her like cattle. Clara ran. She scrambled, dropping the feed, slipping in the mud. "Get away from her!" Silas roared. He ran back into the barn, grabbed his rifle from the pegs, and fired. He did not aim to kill. He aimed to warn. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt just in front of Pike's horse. The animal reared, screaming, and Pike cursed, fighting the reins. Clegg had already dismounted, taking cover behind the thick woodpile. "He's armed! Pike, get her!" Pike got his horse under control. He saw Silas in the barn doorway. He raised his own rifle. Clara was trapped. She was in the open yard, halfway between the barn and the cabin. Pike to her left, Clegg to her right. Silas saw it. He saw Pike leveling his rifle. Not at him, but at Clara. He did not think. He acted. He left the cover of the barn. He ran, his rifle in one hand, shouting her name. "Clara, run!" He was putting himself between her and Pike's aim. He was a bigger target. Clegg fired from the woodpile. The bullet hit Silas like a hammer. It caught him high, in the left side, just under the arm. He grunted a sharp, sudden exhalation of breath, and stumbled. He did not fall. His momentum carried him forward. He grabbed Clara's arm, his grip like iron, and he shoved her, bodily, toward the cabin porch. "Go! Get inside! Go!" She fell up the steps, her hands scraping on the rough wood. Pike fired, his bullet thudding into the cabin door, splinters exploding where Clara's head had been a second before. Silas was on the porch, his rifle useless in one hand, his side a spreading flower of red. He was trying to get to the door. Pike stood up from behind the trough, where he had taken cover. He saw Silas, wounded, exposed. He smiled, a broken-toothed grin. He raised his pistol, taking slow, careful aim. He never fired. The window of the cabin exploded inward. Clara, she had not panicked. She had not hidden. She had done exactly as Silas had taught her. She had run to his second rifle, the heavy sharps he kept over the mantel. She shoved the barrel through the broken glass. She did not aim. She just pointed. She saw the man aiming at Silas. She pulled the trigger. The recoil was brutal, slamming the stock into her shoulder and throwing her back. But the shot was true. Pike screamed. It was a high, awful sound. His pistol flew from his hand. He staggered back, clutching his right arm. Blood, dark and arterial, poured through his fingers. "She shot me! The bitch shot my arm!" Silas used the moment. He kicked the door open, fell inside, and slammed it shut, dropping the heavy bar. The cabin was plunged into a sudden, tense quiet. Outside, Pike was screaming. Inside, there was only the sound of Silas's harsh, ragged breathing. He slumped against the door, his rifle clattering to the floor. His hand was pressed to his side, but the blood was already running between his fingers. "Silas!" Clara was at his side, her face white, her eyes huge. "Oh, God! Silas! You're hit!" "Window!" he gasped, his teeth clenched. "Watch! The window! You're shot!" she sobbed, fumbling with his shirt. "Clara!" His voice was iron. It cut through her panic. "The window! He has a partner! We're barricaded!" She understood. This was not over. She took a deep breath, her body shaking, but her eyes hardened. She grabbed a clean dish towel from the table and shoved it into Silas's hand. "Hold this. Here, press hard, as hard as you can." She picked up the rifle she had dropped. Her shoulder was already a universe of pain. She did not care. She crept to the window, peering out through the broken pane. "You in there?" Clegg's voice. He was still at the woodpile. "You just made this a whole lot worse. Monroe, you're harboring a murderer, and now you're an accomplice." "Go to hell!" Clara screamed, her voice surprising her with its strength. "We'll burn you out!" Clegg yelled. "Give her up, and we'll let you live." "He's lying," Silas grunted from the floor. He was pale, a fine sheen of sweat on his forehead. "I know," Clara said. Tense hours passed. The sun began to sink, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The shadows in the yard grew long. Clegg fired a few shots, thudding them into the thick log walls, trying to scare them. Clara fired back once, sending him ducking. Pike's screaming had faded. He had either bled out or limped away. It did not matter. Clegg was still there. Silas was fading. The towel was soaked. His breathing was shallow. Clara knelt beside him, her terror returning. She ripped more cloth, trying to staunch the bleeding, but it was too high, too deep. "Silas," she whispered, her tears dripping onto his hand. "Silas, don't you leave me!" Her voice broke. "Please, after all this, after everything, you don't leave me too." He opened his eyes. They were hazy, but they found hers. His hand, the one not pressed to his side, found her hand. His grip was weak, but he held on. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "I'm here," she sobbed. He managed a faint, pained smile. "I already came back to life." She stared at him, her heart breaking. He was saying goodbye. And then they heard it. Horses, many horses, and a voice, a new voice. "Clegg, you at the woodpile. This is Sheriff Brody. Put down your weapon, or so help me God, I will put you down." Clara and Silas looked at each other. Was it a trick? "Monroe! Silas Monroe!" the voice bellowed. "We've got you surrounded." "Sheriff?" Silas whispered, his voice stronger. Through the window, Clara could see them. 3 riders. One wore the badge of Henson's Creek, Sheriff Brody. Another was a young deputy she did not know. And the third was the young man from Judge Harlan's office. "He's there!" the deputy yelled, pointing. "Pike! He's by the trough!" Pike was indeed there, passed out from blood loss. Clegg, at the woodpile, stood slowly, his hands in the air. "Don't shoot! I was bringing in a fugitive! I got paper!" "Your paper's void. Clegg," Brody said, dismounting, his shotgun leveled. The sheriff cuffed Clegg's hands. The third rider, the young deputy from Harlan's office, ran to the cabin door. "Mrs. Cunningham, it's over. We got the wire. Judge Harlan sent me." Clara fumbled with the bar, her hands shaking so badly she could barely lift it. She pulled the door open. The young man stood there, his hat in his hand, his eyes wide as he took in the broken window. Silas on the floor. The blood. "Ma'am," he said, holding out a sealed document. "Judge Harlan sends his compliments. He got the wire from Kansas. The fire it was ruled accidental, lightning strike. The charges they were false, ma'am, from your husband's creditors. They've been dropped. You're free." Clara took the paper. She stared at the official seal. Free. She looked at Silas, bleeding on her floor, but breathing. She looked at the sheriff, hauling the conscious bounty hunter to his feet. She saw Pike, the other hunter, being tended to by the deputy. He was alive, moaning, his arm a ruin. He would be arrested. "He's wounded," Clara said, her voice hollow. "Get him on his horse," Brody ordered. "Both of them." He looked at Clegg. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, and he pointed at Pike, "you'll hang for it." The deputy who arrested Pike was not the one from the judge. The outline says, "One bounty hunter limps away. The other is arrested. Let's fix the ending." Sheriff Brody dismounted. "Clegg, you're under arrest." He cuffed the man. He looked over at Pike, who was stirring, groaning. "Deputy, get him." But as the deputy approached, Pike, in a burst of pained, desperate adrenaline, scrambled to his feet. He clutched his bloody arm and made a run for the dense aspen grove behind the barn. "Stop!" the deputy yelled, firing a shot into the air. But Pike was gone, crashing through the trees. "Let him go," Brody grunted. "He won't get far. He's marked. The wolves will have him by morning." He turned to the cabin, his gun holstered. "Silas, you alive in there?" The young deputy from Harlan's office ran to the door as Clara opened it. "Ma'am," he said, holding out the document. "Judge Harlan sends his compliments. The charges have been dropped. You're free." Clara took the paper. She looked at the words. She looked at Silas, who was watching her, his eyes clear. She looked back at the deputy, and then she knelt, pressing the paper to Silas's bloody hand. "We're free," she whispered. Spring did not just arrive. It had to fight for the land. It came first as a whisper of warmth, then as a flood. The deep snows of the high country, the snows that had almost killed Clara and had trapped them in their small world, now became a torrent. The creek roared, a muddy, angry sound, spilling its banks. The world was a sea of brown mud, soft, sucking, and treacherous. But in the cabin, the fight was of a different kind. It was for a single life. Silas did not recover quickly. The bullet from Clegg's rifle had not been a clean wound. Sheriff Brody and his deputy had helped Clara get Silas onto the big bed. The bed that had been Rebecca's. The bed that had become theirs. The doctor from Henson's Creek, a gruff, whiskey-smelling man named Elias, had ridden up 2 days later. navigating the washed-out trails. He had dug the bullet out on the kitchen table, a brutal, bloody affair that had left Silas gray and unconscious. "He's strong," Doc Elias had said, wiping his instruments on a rag. "The bullet missed his lung, but it tore up the muscle. He'll live, if the fever doesn't take him. And it will try." The fever came, as predicted. It came like a thief, stealing his strength and his reason. For 10 days, Silas was not himself. He was a shaking, sweating body, lost in a landscape of old nightmares. He called out. He called for Rebecca. He called for his mother. He shouted at Pike, the bounty hunter, and at the blizzard. And through it all, Clara was there. She was no longer the frightened, hesitant woman who had stumbled from the snow. The gunfight, the act of saving Silas's life, had forged something new in her. It was not hardness. It was a kind of unbreakable, quiet certainty. This was her place. This was her man. And she would not let him go. She was tireless. She sat by his bed for hours, for days, it seemed, until time blurred into a cycle of firelight and weak sun. She bathed him, her hands steady, her touch no longer tentative, but proprietary. She cleaned the seeping, angry wound, her stomach roiling at the smell, but her hands never shaking. She boiled water. She tore their last clean sheets into bandages. She forced broth, and then water, teaspoon by teaspoon, between his cracked lips. When he thrashed, she was the one who held him down, her small body braced against his, her voice a low, constant murmur in his ear. "Hush, Silas. It's all right. I'm here. You're safe. I'm right here. You're not leaving." In his delirium, he would sometimes mistake her. His eyes, clouded with fever, would focus on her. "Rebecca?" he'd rasp. The first time, it had felt like a small, sharp pain in her chest, but she did not flinch. "No, Silas," she'd say, her voice soft and firm, wiping his face with a cool, damp cloth. "It's Clara. I'm here." He would sink back, but his hand, hot and dry, would grope for hers, and he would hold on, his grip surprisingly strong. Slowly, over 2 weeks, the fever broke. It left him as weak as a newborn, his large frame gaunt, the skin stretched tight over his bones. His beard was unkempt, his eyes hollow, but they were his eyes. They were clear. He woke one morning, the 4th morning without the fever, and the cabin was quiet. He could hear the sound of the creek, roaring. He smelled bread, fresh bread. He turned his head, the simple movement an agony, and saw her. She was not by his bed. She was at the table, her back to him, kneading dough. Her hair was tied up, and the sun, coming through the new, clean glass of the window Brody had brought them, lit the fine hairs on the back of her neck. She was humming. It was the lullaby. He just watched her. He watched the strength in her arms, the confident set of her shoulders. She was no longer a shadow in his home. She was the center of it. She had taken his grief, his violence, his sickness, and she had not broken. She had healed. "Clara," he said. His voice was a dry croak he barely recognized. She started, her hands freezing in the dough. She turned, a smudge of flour on her cheek. Her face, when she saw him, when she saw his clear, lucid eyes watching her, was a miracle. The worry, the exhaustion, it all fell away, replaced by a smile so bright it hurt him to look at. "Silas," she breathed. She wiped her hands on her apron and rushed to the bed, her smile falling as she saw his pain. "You're awake. You're truly awake." "How long?" he asked. "The fever's been gone 4 days. You've been very sick, almost 3 weeks since the fight." 3 weeks. He had lost 3 weeks of his life. He looked at his hand, pale and thin on the dark blanket. You stayed." "Of course I stayed," she said, her voice fierce. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand going to his forehead, an automatic, practiced gesture. "Where else would I go?" She poured him a cup of water, and this time, when she held it to his lips, he drank. He was weak, but he was alive, and she was the reason. The recovery was slow. He was a man of action. and being trapped in the bed was a kind of torture, but Clara was a firm nurse. She had, he noted, developed a bossy streak. "You are not getting up," she declared, when he tried to swing his legs over the side. "Not until you eat this." She fed him broth, then stew, then the fresh-baked bread with honey. He hated it. He hated being weak, but he did as she said. He watched as she managed his world. She fed the chickens, she milked the 2 cows, she tended to Jeb, she cleaned his rifle. She did the work of 2 people, and she did it without complaint. She did it with a kind of quiet joy. She was home, finally. After another week, he was allowed to sit on the porch. Clara half supported him, his arm draped over her small shoulders, his body shaking with the effort. He sat in the rocking chair, a blanket over his knees, and just breathed. Spring had truly arrived. The mud was drying, the endless brown giving way to a faint, brilliant green. The aspens were budding, their leaves a pale, trembling color. The air was soft. It smelled of wet earth and new life. "It's good," he managed to say. Clara stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "It is." He saw her then, looking up at the hill, the bare patch of earth, the pine cross. He had not been up there since the day he spoke to Rebecca. Clara had not asked, but now he saw a new purpose in her eyes. A few days later, when he was strong enough to walk the yard on his own, he found her there. She had climbed the hill. She had a spade, and in a small cloth bag at her feet were small, budding flowers, wild columbines, dug from the creek bed. She was kneeling, in the same spot he had knelt, her hands in the dirt. She was planting them, carefully, around the base of the pine cross. He walked up the hill, his steps slow but steady. He stood behind her, watching. She did not look up, but she knew he was there. I hope it's all right," she said, her voice quiet. It looks so lonely, so bare." She loved flowers," Silas said, his voice thick. "She was always trying to make them grow. The soil, it's thin up here." "I'll carry water," Clara said. "I'll make them grow." He knelt beside her. The movement sent a sharp pain through his side, but he ignored it. He looked at the name, Rebecca Monroe. For the first time, the sight of it did not bring a cold, hard knot of guilt. It brought a strange, soft sadness, a memory. I have some seeds," he said, his voice low. "In a tin, in the barn. I never used them. I'll plant them," Clara said, her hand resting on his arm. They stayed there for a long time, the 2 of them, kneeling before the grave of the woman who had, in her own way, brought them together. They did not speak of her as a ghost. They did not speak of her as a painful memory. "Thank you, Rebecca," Clara whispered, so low Silas almost did not hear it. "For sending me home." Silas put his arm around her. It was the first time he had truly, freely, held her since before the gunfight. He held her, and they looked out over the valley, his valley, their valley, as it came to life. The ranch flourished, with Silas's strength returning and Clara's tireless energy. The place was transformed. The broken fences were not just mended, they were rebuilt. The garden, fed by water Clara hauled every morning, exploded with life, beans, squash, and the bright, hopeful faces of Rebecca's flowers. The cabin, once a dark, male-dominated space, was now a home. It smelled of bread, of soap, and of the wild herbs Clara hung from the rafters to dry. One day, they rode to town. It was the first time for Clara since Silas had brought her, near dead, from the snow. She was terrified. She wore her best dress, a simple blue calico she had sewn herself, and the tin locket, now polished, was tucked beneath it. As they rode down the muddy main street, silence followed them. Men on the boardwalk stopped talking. Women, peering from behind curtains, watched. They were a curiosity. The hermit of the mountains, Silas Monroe, and the woman who had come back from the dead, the woman with the bounty on her head, Silas, however, was not the man he had been. He was no longer the silent, grieving hermit. He was a man with a purpose. He held his head high. He helped Clara dismount in front of Patterson's mercantile, his hand on her waist, a gesture of clear, public possession. He opened the door for her. The store, as before, was full. Old man Patterson was at the counter. Sheriff Brody was by the stove, drinking coffee. Everyone stared. Clara's hand tightened on Silas's arm. "Morning, Patterson," Silas said, his voice calm and clear. "Sheriff," Patterson, his face unreadable, just nodded. "Monroe." Sheriff Brody, a big, weary man, looked at Clara. He looked at her hard, his eyes taking in her pale, refined face, the hand she had on Silas's arm. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, a respectful, final acknowledgement. The story was already town legend, how the runaway widow had not been a widow, but a victim, how she had saved Silas's life, shooting Pike through the arm, how the law had, in the end, proven her innocent. Henson's Creek was a hard place, but it respected strength, and it respected survival. A woman near the back, Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, stepped forward. "Mrs. Monroe," she said, her voice high and clear. We are glad to see you well." Clara looked at Silas, confused. It's Cunningham." "Not according to the paper I filed, ma'am," Sheriff Brody said, his mouth twitching in a small smile as he sipped his coffee. "Judge Harlan sent the marriage certificate last week. Figured you two had other things on your mind." Silas stared at the sheriff. Then he looked at Clara. Her face was a mask of shock, her cheeks turning a bright, beautiful red. He did?" Silas said. "Seems Judge Harlan," Brody said, "believes in tying up loose ends. Congratulations. Monroe." Silas, in the middle of the mercantile, in front of the whole town, put his hand on Clara's cheek, and he smiled. He looked at her, at his wife. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, testing the name. "Mrs. Monroe," she whispered back, and this time, her laugh was not a rusty, startled thing. It was a clear, bright sound that filled the room. Life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm, a rhythm of work and food and long nights. The fear was gone. The ghosts, while not vanished, had taken their place as quiet ancestors, not as haunting tyrants. One evening, as the summer sun began its long, slow descent, painting the high peaks in shades of deep purple and blood orange, Silas was at the water trough, washing the grime of the day from his face and arms. Clara was in the yard, brushing Jeb, the horse, which had once been surly, now stood with his head low, nudging her pocket for the piece of apple he knew was there. She was wearing a simple sundress, her arms bare, her hair in a thick, dark braid. She was humming the lullaby. Silas watched her. He watched the way the fading light caught the curve of her neck, the new, womanly roundness of her hips. She had filled out. She was no longer the starved, broken creature he had pulled from the snow. She was vibrant. She was life itself. He walked up behind her, so quietly she did not hear him. He put his hands on her waist. She started, a small, happy gasp, and leaned back against his chest. His arms came around her, his hands splaying protectively over her stomach. She had been different. The last 2 weeks, quieter, a new, secret-keeping look in her eyes, a paleness in the mornings that he had, at first, attributed to the heat. But now, as he held her, he knew, he could feel it. A new, fierce, protective instinct rose in him, an instinct he had buried 5 years ago. "Clara," he said, his voice rough. She turned in his arms, her face serious, her dark eyes searching his. She took his large, calloused hand and pressed it flat against her belly, just below her navel. "Silas," she whispered. I'm with child." He stopped breathing. The world stopped. The crickets, the wind, the distant cry of a nighthawk. It all went silent. He looked at her face, at the fear in her eyes, the fear that this news would break him, that it would bring the ghosts back. And then he looked down at his hand, resting on her body, and he felt it, a newness, a beginning, a life. His face, which had been so stern, so carved by grief, crumpled. He did not make a sound, but his shoulders began to shake. A deep, silent, racking sob tore through him. It was not grief, it was not pain, it was joy, a joy so profound, so terrifying, it was indistinguishable from agony. He knelt. He knelt in the dirt at her feet, his body trembling. He pressed his face against her, holding her belly, his tears soaking the thin cotton of her dress. "Silas?" she whispered, her hands in his hair, her own tears falling. Are you afraid?" He looked up, his face a ruin, but his eyes were shining. "This time," he whispered, the words a vow, a prayer to a new God. "This time, we'll both live." He rose, pulling her into an embrace so tight it was as if he could merge them into one body, protect them both from the world. He held her for a long time, just breathing her in. Finally, he loosened his grip, his hands moving to her shoulders. He looked at her, truly looked at her, his wife, his savior, the mother of his child. The golden light of the sunset wrapped around them. Clara smiled, her face wet with her own tears, and rested her head against his shoulder. "Your late wife," she said, her voice soft against his skin. She led me here." Silas turned his head, pressing his lips to her hair, his heart so full he thought it might burst. He looked up at the small, quiet hill, at the flowers blooming around the pine cross, bright spots of color in the fading light. "She brought me back," Silas said, his voice a low, grateful murmur. "But you kept me here." She lifted her head, and he kissed her. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of their first night. It was not the clumsy, fearful kiss of the barn. It was a kiss of pure, unhurried, hard-won peace. It was the kiss of a beginning, not an end. The wind stirred the new grass at their feet, and in the high, clean, Colorado air, a new life, bought with blood and pain, but sealed with a fierce and tender love, finally, truly, began. Thank you for listening to this story. We truly appreciate you spending this time with us. We would love to know where you are listening from. Please take a moment to comment and let us know. Your thoughts and stories are what make this community special. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, for more stories like this one. Let us know what you thought of Silas and Clara's journey in the comments.